Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to tackle one of the September Digital Forge offerings from Anvil Industry, and this one's special because of the fact it is part of their 10th anniversary celebration pack, which is just characters. It is so many characters, including a handful of rehashes of older designs. So there is an Exo-Lord Blacksmith in there, for example, who was their 5th anniversary figure, now available in digital form if you've got a 3D printer. Now this fella, he was printed as well. He's come off of my Elegoo Mars 2 Pro, which is always really fun to say. And as soon as these dropped, I downloaded and I was printing them straight away, because there are some absolutely fantastic offerings this month. Now there are going to be resin releases of, I believe, most of these guys. Don't quote me on that. You can ask the Anvil fellas if you need to double check. But this was a lot of fun to paint. It is a little more involved than some of the other tutorials I've done, so when it concerns skin and such, we're going to spend a little more time on that than I ordinarily would, and I think you can probably see the difference in result there. Whatever the case, the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. Now, when you first load this handsome chap into your slicer, you're going to find that the model itself actually has a chest piece, like an armored piece, and a helmet, but the canny chaps at Anvil have made sure that everything is a separate shell, so you can take those off. I imported the miniature into Mesh Mixer, which is a free program, separated the shells, and then just deleted the armor and the helmet so that I could print this off. The supports were all still in place. That's a process that took me no more than about 2 minutes. So yeah, it's a really nice touch from Anvil, and something that I really appreciate, because it gives you some variation on a single STL if you want to do something different. So once the print is finished, I've hit him with a primer spray of Grey Seer from Citadel. Reason being, I thought about doing him with a skin color, maybe Barbarian Flesh, but things like his jacket and his trousers are going to benefit from a slightly more neutral color than that. Now overall, it's not likely to make a huge amount of difference, but I thought it was worth starting from a neutral thing just in case. So we need to start off with the lowest part of the miniature because, we always want to be able to paint over and fix our mistakes as we go. So we're going to start with his skin. Now there isn't really a right way of doing this. I'm going to start with Cadian Fleshtone here and apply this, not massively carefully, over all of his areas of skin. So when I come to parts that have got like his dog tags and similar, I'm just going to paint straight over the top of those. You'll probably find this needs a couple of coats for a nice solid base. And I'm using this instead of something like Bugman's Glow because we're going to use quite a lot of very light colors and then shade them down. Now once you've got his skin toned down, it's time to decide what to do about his jacket. And I had kind of a conundrum here because it is very clearly designed like it ought to be a Commissar, black jacket with this turned back in red sort of thing. But I wanted an officer to lead troops rather than stand at the back and inspire them by taking his shirt off. Either way, what I'm going to do is I've turned to green-grey from Vallejo. What I'm going to do is kind of a dark, almost sort of Vietnam-era inspired green jacket. Because the problem is by the time we get to camo, most of these overcoat designs have really disappeared from most modern militaries. But then I remembered, we're not doing real-world modern military. We're painting a spaceman. So my spaceman's going to have a green-grey jacket. Now when it comes to this area between his legs, where it's going to be difficult to reach, don't worry too much. You might grab yourself a medium base brush or similar. I'm just using one of my little cheap flat-edged brushes and just jam it in there. Don't worry about hitting his trousers because we're going to paint those next. Now after 2 coats, we've got a nice solid green. Let's flick them around there, and that's looking pretty swish. If you want a similar color in the Citadel range, you can look at Deathworld Forest. It is a slightly more rich green, a little touch of yellow to it, but, we're making this up. We're not following a real uniform here. Now, on that note, just a real quick one. When you're applying something to a coat like this, try and keep your brush moving in the same direction as you're putting down your layers of paint. It might sound crazy, but there's a little bit of physics here, and I tend to find when it comes to shade these miniatures, if I've done that, I get a much smoother finish with the shade. So, I don't know, maybe I'm just being paranoid, but it always seems to work for me. Now we're going to move on, and I have here Morghast Bone. If you want to use Vallejo colors here, you might use Iraqi Sand instead. It's pretty much a perfect match. I am just going to do a quick coat over his trousers, and this is going to look absolutely bonkers going on, but in a couple of minutes you'll see where I'm going with this. Now obviously we don't want him in bright yellow pantaloons, although you might, in which case stick to this. But I've got here one of my little flat brushes, and again, I cannot recommend enough. Go to the stationery aisle in your local, if you're American, your drugstore, your stationery supply, wherever, and find these cheap nasty brushes. Every place has got something similar, you know. I'm going to use this because this nice flat edge is going to help with some of the camo patterns we're going to put on. I'm just dabbing it into some Deathworld green, and I'm going to start just sort of poking, you know, jabbing this green on. Now with old school British DPM, you tend to find that green is actually the predominant color here. So you want to cover quite a bit of this and leave some of the Morghast bone showing through. So I'm just going to have some fun now, jabbing little random shapes of green and then connecting them up. Now here we really want ragged, so you'll see I've covered quite a bit of that in green, but there's still some of the yellow poking through. We're going to move on. I've got Catachan flesh, and this is a nice warm brown, a little bit lighter than the likes of Dryad bark, which once we shade it is going to work perfectly for our DPM. So I'm going to poke some of this off onto a bit of tissue paper and start applying, again, just little jabs which cross the green and the yellow. And you're looking to cover about a third of the total area with this. So the bonus with these flat brushes, you see, let's get them into focus, is you just dab a little and then turn your brush and you'll get these neat random shapes. So let's go over now and add some more of this Catachan flesh. Now the final stage on the camo is going to be to apply some little black slashes, and for this I'm using Corvus black. You could use straight black if you liked, but this is just a little off black, which I think works a wee bit better for clothing and such. It looks a little more natural. So I've just prepped up some of this with a little bit of water in it, and I'm going to start just very small flicks of my brush. Particularly this will show up across the green and the yellow, so you want to add just a little bit of it there. My goodness me, I've lost control of that. But my suggestion here is take a look at some of the DPM you'll find on old photos, you know, online. The black slashes were pretty random, but generally much thinner than the other colors on this camo pattern. So take your time, cruise around, and just add some of these little wiggles. Now, as well as doing the little black flickies on his trousers, I've also painted in his weapons, so his pistol in the holster there, as well as the rifle. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I got about halfway through painting the rifle before I lost my mind, and I switched to German grey from Vallejo. It dries exactly the same color as Corvus grey does, Corvus black, sorry, and it covers much, much better. So save yourself some sanity, pick up some German grey if you get the opportunity. Strong recommend from me. Now what I've got is some Dryad bark, and we're going to paint in any leather details. Now, it's really up to you how much of this is leather. I'm going to paint his boots with this, but I'm also going to paint his webbing. So he's not got much of this, but his belt and his holster here. Now, this probably wouldn't be, you know, leather in reality. It's got quite a lot of cloth style folds to it, but I'm going with what I think is going to look cool. Now I've got myself a little iron hand steel, and I'm going to paint in some of the metallic details. Now, I've really been thinking about this. I don't think I'm going to do this on his weapon itself, but I am going to paint in his dog tags, the little chain as well. I'm going to do the grip on his combat blade in this. And as well, let's see if I can get in here. Ooh, it's a little... I don't know if you'll see it, but I actually can reach the blade at the back there fairly easily, so don't worry about messing up your colors there. Now these two grenades on his belt, in order that they stand out a bit, I'm going to give them a nice bright green. This is Waaagh flesh, although anything you like will work just fine here. I think just a little bit of that really rich colour is going to help to make them stand out. Now likewise, his hair of course can be any colour that you like, but I've got here some German Camo Pale Brown, which is a really nice shade of quite a, well, pale brown really, but it works great for hair. Now that's all the details on the officer himself painted, but I've got here a little Mechanicus standard grey, and I'm going to follow that up with some Ushabti bone. And what I'm going to do is just paint in this rock on his base and the skulls that are on it. Now I've also used a little bit of Deathworld Forest for just a couple of the green details that were sitting on that rock. Anything you like there will do the job. Now there's one last stage before we get to actually shading him, because you know that's coming. I have here some Vallejo Pastel Green, and I am working it into one of my makeup brushes, because we're actually going to dry brush the details on the coat before we shade him. So I'm going to very, very, very lightly start flicking across some of these raised areas of detail. And I've got next to nothing on my brush, right? It's very important that you're not leaving much behind, and you can go over the same point several times to slowly build up that color. What you'll end up with as a result is quite a smooth transition from pastel green to the grey-green beneath. And when we shade it, this is going to look like a battered, sun-worn, faded old jacket. Now after a few passes and some time spent building up that color, you're going to get this really cool transition. And I do recommend switch to a smaller brush when you come to the details on his front there. Now one of the most common questions when it comes to dry brushing is somebody telling me, well, I did what you did and it didn't come out the same way. Simplest answer, less paint on your brush. Like, that is almost always going to be the solution there. At any rate, we've finally got all of the base colors down and some highlighting on that jacket. So what we're going to do now is shade him. Now it's up to you if you do want to go the route of using, say, Reikland Fleshshade on his skin, but I am going to just stick to one shade for the whole miniature like I normally do, and I'll give you two guesses what it's going to be. Out comes the Agrax Earthshade, and we're going to apply this over the entire miniature. Now when it comes to his skin, once you've sort of splodged some on, just take a second with your brush and move it around and away from areas where you think it might have pulled a little too much, particularly on his face and this fella's ludicrous abs. You'll find that'll save you a bit of work later on. But whatever the case, let's go around now the whole miniature, giving it a coat of this. And same deal, try and keep your brush moving in the same direction on his coat. And then once I've got all of my miniature shaded, it's going to go in the sun for about half an hour. Now once that shade's dried, it pulls everything together and, hey, that's a finished miniature really, isn't it? In particular, that pre-dry brush on the coat looks really cool. It's brilliant, really simple to do. Like I said, slow down, use less paint on your dry brush if you're worried about that. But the skin, to me, looks a little bit flat at this stage. So because it is pretty much the main event on this miniature, what I've got is a little bit of Reikland Fleshshade mixed in about half and half with Lahmian medium. Now it doesn't need to be a totally precise measurement, but if you do, make some of this up, err on the side of just a fraction more Fleshshade than not. And I'm going to apply just a little bit of this over all of the skin again. Now once that shade is dried, he's going to be a lot more warm. There's that little bit of redness to him. But as a bonus, he's a lot darker than he was previously, so we can actually go straight back to Cadian Fleshtone to highlight his skin. So what I'm going to do is just pick out raised areas of musculature, of which there is a lot, with just a little bit of Cadian Fleshtone. And because we're using the base color, when this dries, this is going to be quite a natural transition of color. So particularly on arms, all you want to do is go up to where you can see there's a little dark recess in here. Just avoid that when you paint in this layer again. And pretty much the shade is going to give you a guide on what to avoid and what to highlight. Now this stage is probably the most time consuming so far, but it's totally worth it. I mean, flip him around, this guy is jacked. But what I'm going to do now is just a little more to the skin. So I've got here some Kislev flesh. And when it comes to painting skin, there's not really a single way of highlighting. It's really a personal choice, what sort of style you like the look of. So some folks would stop here and don't really much care for more going on, but I think we can do just a little bit more to make some of these areas pop. So I'm going to very carefully just add a little bit of Kislev flesh to some of these areas, which will be a lot easier without the camera in the way. But unfortunately, the only real answer to this question is going to be that dirty word practice. So have some fun, print a few of these guys off, and get painting extremely buff dudes. Let's just quickly flick him around, and yeah, I'm going to call the skin finished there. I've gone back to my Pastel Green, and what I'm going to do is paint in just a couple of sharp highlights on the front of his jacket, just because I think we can get a little bit more detail visible on his lapels. So for this, I'm going to use just the very tip of the brush. Now, for example, in this little spot here where I've put a little bit too much into there and I've sort of slipped into the shade that I want, I'm just going to go back with a little bit of Agrax Earthshade in a second, and that will disappear. I'll move on to some Gorthor brown, and we're going to use this to highlight the leather. Now this is not ordinarily strictly necessary, but because I've used quite dark colors against one another, I want a little bit of highlighting here just to make this stand out against his trousers. Now I'm going to use just a little bit of Stormhost silver to pick out his dog tags, because I want these to shine just a little more on his chest. Now we'll turn to a tiny wee bit of Baneblade brown just to highlight some of his hair, and you can be quite sparing with this. And then finally I'm going to turn to a little bit of Stormvermin Fur just to highlight the edge of some of the details of his weapon. Now, as with all of the details that we've painted so far, if you do find you end up with a little too much of your highlight color on, just go back to your base color and you'll be able to touch that up. No one will spot the mistake. Now, once I'm finished with this, I'm going to take him outside, give him a quick spray varnish. I'm going to use Vallejo's, goodness me, sorry, I'm whispering because I'm concentrating. It happens all the time. Vallejo's matte varnish. And yeah, pop a base on him. We'll see what he looks like when he is all finished. And there at last, our pin-up jungle officer is complete. And I always say it, but I really enjoyed painting this guy. I know it's a little bit more involved than some of the tutorials, but I do strongly recommend find a way you like painting skin and really practice it. You'll get some pretty good results without having to get into really complex mixes. So again, congratulations to Anvil Industry for 10 years in business. That is a long time in small business terms, and especially with the last year and a half or so being what it has been, the fact that they're still going is really fantastic, especially for us hobbyists who like unusual kits or stuff that fills gaps in some of the other ranges out there. So I thoroughly recommend do cruise along to the Digital Forge. If you're on Patreon and you've got a 3D printer, you cannot beat that. There is also the resin version of this fella available on their website. So if you don't have a printer, you're not going to miss out. He is wearing a cap, but he's got a choice of like bionic leg or normal leg for the right side. So thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking over in paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support is invaluable, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Facebook and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.